Welcome back to Red Hat Redemption. We're on to round 3, where we will touch on crime, perhaps the single biggest boogeyman on the list. And it's understandable why. Our media is absolutely saturated with it, from countless movies and TV shows of cartels and mafias to roughly 500 million spin-offs of CSI, FBI, police shows, etc. And that's not even covering all of the stories that we absolutely love of vigilantes single-handedly taking on criminals when the system fails them. There's probably about 50 of them from Liam Neeson alone. We love worrying about crime, perhaps because we're an incredibly wealthy nation where even the average citizen has a lot to lose. And I start with that little mini rant because despite the fact that crime has been steadily dropping, it still very often works as an excuse to crack down on various civil liberties. To be specific, violent crime had dropped by roughly 50% since the early 1990s. That is not only a gigantic drop-off, it's also continued for over 3 decades. This is, to be clear, an unprecedented trend. You certainly wouldn't know it if you frequently listen to Trump rallies, which are very short on actual studies and stats, but very heavy on anecdotes and xenophobia. And as you're likely already aware, immigrants are the most common scapegoat. This is, again, a very common play from the fascist playbook. Jews, for example, were very often attacked as more violent and conspiring against Germany during the Nazi regime. And we also saw similar rumors about Jews, as well as Italian and Irish immigrants in the early 20th century here in America. And it's worth noting, because of modern attempts to take tragic and awful real events like the murders of Laken Riley and Irina Zarutska and influencing the public to believe that this is how many immigrants behave, that the Nazis also used real events and turned them into trends as well. One example is that of Bloody Sunday in a Polish city I will not even attempt to pronounce, where violent uprisings occurred during the invasion of Poland by Germany. Jews were, of course, primarily blamed for this. To be clear, the deaths of Riley and Zarutska were horrific tragedies that should not be downplayed, but they should also not be used as a pretense for further violence against immigrant communities, the vast majority of which would also want justice to be done to their killers. And when it comes to crime rates, particularly violent crimes, study after study has shown that immigrants commit them at lower rates than naturally born citizens, from right-leaning states like Texas to national trends tracked by the FBI, which also shows that as the immigration population has increased, crime has decreased. In fact, some studies show that they're actually 2 to 3 times less likely to commit a crime than those who are US born. Perhaps most noteworthy, the Department of Justice under Trump's second term quietly removed a link from its own website that proved this, but did not replace it with any kind of study countering this claim, maybe because there wasn't one. They simply deleted it in hopes that no one would notice. The fact is, the stats and trends run directly contrary to the administration's narrative, and as we've already covered in depth in part 1, they aren't targeting the worst of the worst in the first place. But it isn't just that they're out here targeting children with blue hats and the dreaded ice cream man, or this case where ICE agents faked car trouble in order to lure out a good Samaritan who unwittingly tried to help them fix that car. Remember how we covered employees being pulled from a wide variety of agencies? Well, as it turns out, that also applies to ICE itself. So ICE is divided into 2 main agencies, the ERO, which stands for Enforcement and Removal Operations, and HSI, which stands for Homeland Security Investigations. The latter focuses on complex cases like transnational crime, national security threats, human trafficking, and drug smuggling. As one example of a recent noteworthy case, they were heavily involved in the Diddy investigation. Do those sound like the types of cases we should be focusing on? If so, I agree. And so do the vast majority of Americans. But these HSI agents are being pulled away from these cases, just as the FBI is being pulled away from white-collar crimes. And just as the rich continue to get richer by scamming the American people as an administration run by a billionaire, surrounded by big tech billionaires, tells law enforcement to focus more on construction workers in a 7-Eleven, that same billionaire, who is also a convicted sex criminal, also tells law enforcement to lay off sex crimes. And this is not hyperbole. You can read the exact Executive Order 14159 signed by President Trump, which states, quote, The Secretary of Homeland Security shall ensure that the primary mission of HSI is the enforcement of the illegal entry and unlawful presence of aliens in the United States. And the stats bear this out as well. HSI has worked 33% fewer hours on child exploitation cases. CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, also had its force cut by a third, losing over 1,000 employees. This is particularly concerning given the rapid rate at which cyber attacks are evolving and becoming more deceptive due to the prevalence of AI. And while all of these cuts to these various agencies and task forces occur, it also needs to be pointed out that none of this is actually necessary. One frequently cited statistic that I'll often see from Trump supporters is that Obama actually deported more people over a per year average than Trump, and therefore all the media attention is simply because they don't like Trump. While I do have some real issues with the way that ICE and CBP handled things during Obama's administration as well, I'll cover the rampant criminality of CBP over a wide period in Part 5 later. There are two huge differentiators between his approach and Trump's. Number one, the Trump administration has not only turned mass deportation into a primary campaign driver, it's turned those deportations into a celebration of dehumanization by posting memes of detainees all over social media, which we'll also cover in multiple levels in Part 5. But number two, the Obama administration was quite simply much better at it. In 2014, Obama issued an executive order that defined terrorists, criminal gang members, and convicted felons as the highest priority for deportation. And the resulting numbers bore this out. In 2009, when he started, 69% of deportees fell into the category. And by the time he was done in 2016, that number rose to 94%. Trump, on the other hand, and likely under the influence of Stephen Miller, decided to prioritize asylum seekers instead. This not only led to ICE using detention centers primarily for those without criminal convictions, 68% in 2019, which means a steep drop from Obama's 94% with a conviction to 32% in just 3 years. This also led to a higher rate of releasing undocumented criminals. In fact, in 2019, they released more than twice as many who were convicted of crimes as any year during Biden's presidency. And during his second term, it's even worse, with only 27% having any kind of criminal conviction and only 5% with a violent one. So, yes, more were deported under Obama, but that's more to do with the competence and efficiency of their approach versus the reckless chaos of the Trump regime's approach. And the concerns about the lack of focus on actual criminals are also shared by those with actual experience in DHS and ICE as well. Former DHS intelligence chief John Cohen is on record saying, if FBI agents aren't working on drug gang task forces, there are fewer investigations into violent street gangs and drug trafficking cartels, and that he is, quote, 100% certain that they are tracking that federal agents are being moved out of drug task forces and seeking to determine ways to exploit the reduced resources. So, for all the administration's talk about targeting the cartels and eliminating the flow of drugs into the nation, the reality is that their decisions have hampered our ability to target actual networks because bodies, as ICE frequently calls the humans they detain, are the priority. And speaking of drugs, besides the already covered fact that the high majority of immigrants are not criminals and many are in fact fleeing violent cartels, the idea that the fentanyl crisis is caused by open borders is almost entirely a myth, and unfortunately a very effective one. An NPR poll from 2022 found that 39% of Americans and 60% of Republicans believe that most fentanyl entering the US is smuggled in by illegal border crossers. But the reality is actually the polar opposite. US citizens were 89% of convicted fentanyl traffickers, and 93% of seizures occurred at legal crossing points. The reason for this is simple. US citizens are subject to far less scrutiny, which makes them far more efficient smugglers. They're also more efficient from a volume standpoint, as it's simply far easier to bring more across via a vehicle, with individuals who were stopped by Border Patrol possessing half the amount on average as those who were caught at legal checkpoints. And finally, one more specific contributor to the recent fentanyl outbreak was the travel and asylum restrictions during the pandemic. Because most legal cross-border traffic was banned, fentanyl exploded due to the simple fact that it's easier to conceal than other drugs, with seizures quadrupling from 2019 to 2021. And to make the issue of drugs even worse, Trump recently pardoned the ex-Honduran president Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was given a 45-year sentence for drug trafficking. Over 400 tons of cocaine were trafficked under his scheme, and he is quoted as saying he wanted to shove the drugs right up the noses of the gringos by flooding the United States with cocaine. Trump's justification for this is that his arrest was a setup by the Biden administration, without a shred of evidence or detail. However, the investigation against him spanned several presidencies, including Trump's first term. It's also worth noting that not only is Hernandez a right wing president, he also championed the creation of special economic zones that could set their own taxes and regulations, which is a move that benefited the Trump aligned Silicon Valley titans who invested in them, including Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen. But the law was repealed by his successor, a center left party Libre member, Xiomara Castro. This drug trafficker, Hernandez, also got the red carpet treatment after the pardon, as prison officials paid a specialized tactical team overtime to drive Hernandez from a high security facility in West Virginia to the famed five-star Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. And when it comes to this administration's narrative of being tough on crime and going after the worst of the worst, we also can't ignore the fact that there was a bipartisan border bill that Trump urged Republicans to vote against, saying, "I think we killed it, I think it's dead," before it was even unveiled. This was in February 2024, which means we had nearly a full year of, if you take their word for it, a border crisis with rampant crime, millions of drugs, and countless criminals and cartels just pouring in. This was further confirmed by Republican Senator James Lankford, who said an unnamed popular commenter had, quote, told me flat out, if you try to move a bill that solves the border crisis during this presidential year, I will do whatever I can to destroy you because I do not want you to solve this before the presidential election. Quite simply, they wanted border issues and border chaos to continue in order to get Trump elected. And finally, there's also the testimony of anonymous HSI agents themselves. I'll let these speak for themselves. In response to the question, how much blame do you put on the current administration for all of this? One agent responds, quote, all of it. I wonder if Trump or Vance know what's truly going on. I mainly blame Noam and Stephen Miller for the absurd decisions being made. We literally have child sex trafficking cases left unworked because of this focus on immigration. Anyone at my HQ who dared to speak up was immediately fired. He continues, quote, most offices have dedicated groups that investigate human trafficking, child exploitation, and child sex trafficking. They do amazing work. But since this administration took control, those groups have been deployed for immigration ops, and there isn't enough time or manpower to maintain the child exploitation cases. Those cases are a ton of work and require elaborate undercover activity. They can't do both 12-hour-a-day immigration ops and child exploitation cases. The guidance has been clear. Title 8 enforcement, immigration, is the #1 priority for HSI. Full stop. So cases don't get worked and kids are going unprotected. It's horrible. Another agent echoes this. Morale has never been worse within HSI. We are very frustrated being told some dude with a DUI conviction from 2015 and a final order of removal is a higher priority than someone raping kids or smuggling fentanyl across the border. He continues, it's all just politics. Immigration is a higher priority than literally anything else right now. So a criminal case targeting violent gang members or child exploitation suspects or human traffickers will take a backseat to any immigration crap. That's it for part 3. In part 4 coming up next week, we will touch on assimilation, cultural identity, and the more extreme version, the Great Replacement.